A millionaire disguised himself as a beggar and went to meet the poor girl he was dating. The morning sun bathed the streets of the elegant Polanco neighborhood in Mexico City as Alejandro Montero absently watched through the windows of his most exclusive restaurant. At 32, he was one of the country's most successful businessmen, the owner of a luxury restaurant chain that spanned all of Latin America. Yet, all this wealth didn't fill the emptiness he felt in his heart. His thoughts were interrupted by Manuel, his personal assistant and childhood friend, who approached with a tablet in hand. "Alejandro, I need your signature for the opening of the new restaurant in Guadalajara," Manuel said, noticing his boss's distant gaze. "Are you okay? Lately, you seem more distracted than usual." Alejandro sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You know, Manuel, sometimes I wonder if any of this makes sense, the restaurants, the meetings, the social events. Every time I go out with a woman, all I see is interest in my last name and bank account." Manuel sat down in front of him, setting the tablet aside. "Maybe you should take a break, do something different, meet new people." The conversation was interrupted when Alejandro saw her walk by the park in front of the restaurant again. It was her, the same young woman he had been watching for the past few weeks. Her wavy black hair danced in the breeze as she walked briskly, wearing a simple cafe uniform. Despite her humble attire, there was something in the way she walked, in her smile as she greeted the street vendors, that made her shine with her own light. "Do you see her, Manuel? She passes by at the same time every day. I've never seen such a sincere smile, such a pure look." Manuel followed his friend's gaze and smiled understandingly. "Why don't you go out and introduce yourself?" Alejandro shook his head. "As the millionaire Alejandro Montero? No. I've seen how people change when they know who I am. I want to meet someone who sees me for who I am, not for what I have." That's when an idea began to form. He jumped up, startled. "Remember when we were kids and we dressed up as homeless people? I want to see how she reacts, how she treats someone who seemingly has nothing to offer her." "Have you lost your mind? You know how risky it is to deceive someone like that." But Alejandro wasn't listening anymore, his mind was busy planning every detail. He removed his expensive watch and put it in his pocket. "Manuel, I need your help. Get me worn-out clothes, something that will really make me look like someone in need, and please keep this a secret." Manuel sighed, resigned, knowing how stubborn his friend could be once an idea took hold. "At least you know her name, right?" "Carmen," Alejandro replied with a smile. "I've heard her greet the park vendors, Carmen Suarez." What Alejandro didn't know was that this impulse, this seemingly innocent decision, would trigger a series of events that would change not only his life but also Carmen's, in ways neither of them could imagine. As he watched Carmen walk away one last time as the millionaire he was, Alejandro felt a mix of excitement and guilt. Was it right to deceive someone like that? But in his heart, he knew this could be his only chance to experience something real, something true. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself. "Tomorrow it all begins." Manuel watched his friend with concern, aware that once Alejandro Montero set his mind to something, it was impossible to make him change it. He only hoped this adventure wouldn't end up hurting anyone. The next morning, Miguel Hidalgo Park was bustling with its usual activity. The street vendors were setting up their stalls as the first people began their daily routines. In the shade of a tree, an unrecognizable man settled onto a worn bench. It was Alejandro Montero, though no one would guess it under those shabby clothes and messy hair. Manuel had kept his word. Finding him a convincing outfit, worn-out pants, a faded shirt, and an old sweater with a few holes, Alejandro had tousled his hair and gone several days without shaving. The transformation was astonishing. "Good morning, Don Roberto," a melodious voice called out, and Alejandro recognized it instantly. It was Carmen, greeting the newspaper vendor as she did every morning. "How's your granddaughter? Has she recovered from the flu?" "Much better, Carmencita. Thank you for the tea you recommended. It worked like magic," the elderly man replied with a warm smile. Alejandro watched the scene in fascination. Carmen was wearing her café uniform from *El Rincón del Café* and had her hair pulled back in a simple braid. Despite the early hour, her face radiated an infectious energy. As Carmen approached the bench where Alejandro was sitting, his heart pounded. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, but now that it was happening, nerves threatened to get the best of him. "Good morning, sir. Are you all right? You look a bit pale," Carmen said, approaching cautiously. Alejandro, remembering his role, replied softly, "I'm fine, miss, just a little tired." "Please, take this," Carmen insisted, offering him her breakfast, genuinely moved by his appearance. "Thank you, but I couldn't accept it," Alejandro began, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Please, I insist," Carmen smiled. "My name is Carmen. I work nearby at the cafe. If you need anything, I'm usually here every morning." "Thank you, Carmen. My name is Alberto," Alejandro replied, using the name he had prepared for his character. Just then, Carmen's phone buzzed with a message from her mother, reminding her they needed to buy more medicine. Her expression changed subtly, but she kept smiling. "I have to go. I'm running late for work. Will you be here tomorrow, Don Alberto?" "Yes, I think so," Alejandro replied, surprised by his own excitement at the prospect. "Then I'll see you tomorrow." "Take care," Carmen said, walking away quickly. Alejandro watched her leave, feeling a mix of guilt and fascination. Carmen's kindness had been completely natural, without pretense or ulterior motives. She was exactly as he had imagined her, perhaps even better. That afternoon, back in his office and dressed in his usual Italian suit, Alejandro couldn't focus on work. Manuel entered with several documents requiring his attention. "So, how did your little social experiment go?" Manuel asked, noticing his friend's pensive expression. "It's amazing, Manuel. She's different. Do you know what she did? She gave me her own breakfast without knowing me, without knowing anything about me. And the way she talks to everyone in the park, how she cares about them," Alejandro explained. "Alejandro," Manuel interrupted in a serious tone, "have you thought about how this is going to end? You can't keep pretending to be someone you're not. I just need to get to know her better, understand who she really is. After that, I'll find a way to tell her the truth." Manuel shook his head, worried. "And if she falls in love with Alberto before meeting Alejandro? Have you thought about that?" The question hung in the air as Alejandro looked out the window towards the park, where he had experienced one of the most authentic moments of his life just hours earlier. On his desk, the pastry Carmen had given him remained untouched, wrapped in its napkin, a reminder of her pure gesture. "Just a few more days," Alejandro murmured, more to himself than to Manuel. "I just need a few more days to be sure." What Alejandro didn't know was that Carmen was also thinking about him, that sad-eyed man she had met in the park. While serving coffee at work, she wondered about his story, about the circumstances that had led him to that situation, without imagining that beneath those worn clothes lay a secret that would change her life forever. The small apartment in Colonia Santa Maria la Rivera was modest but impeccably clean. Carmen entered quietly, not wanting to wake her mother, who was resting in the adjoining room. She set her bag on the kitchen table and approached the calendar where she marked off the dates of her mother's medical treatments with red crosses. "Carmen, you're back, my love," her mother's weak voice called, making her turn around. "Mama, you should be resting," Carmen replied, helping her sit on the old sofa in the living room. "The doctor said you need rest." "I can't stay in bed all day, my child. Besides, I'm feeling better," Dona Rosa replied, studying her daughter's face. "You look different today. Did something happen at work? Be careful, my dear. Your good heart sometimes makes you trust people too much," Dona Rosa cautioned with motherly concern. "I know, Mama, but..." Carmen trailed off as she heard a knock on the door. It was Lucia, her best friend and neighbor, who worked as a waitress at *La Corona de Plata*, the upscale restaurant near the park. "Carmen, You won't believe what happened today at the restaurant, Lucia exclaimed as she entered with her usual energy. The owner, Alejandro Montero, was acting very strange. He's normally on top of everything, but today he seemed totally out of it. And you know what's even weirder? Lucia continued. I heard he cancelled all his meetings for the day. He never does that. Maybe he's dealing with personal issues, Carmen replied absent-mindedly. Lucia, do you pass by the park in the mornings? Have you seen a man who sits on the bench near Don Roberto? The new guy? Yes, I've seen him. Why? I spoke to him today. His name is Alberto. There's something about him. I can't explain it, Carmen said. Lucia looked at her friend with concern. Carmen, always wanting to help everyone. Isn't it enough that you're working double shifts to cover your mother's medications? Dona Rosa, overhearing this, sat up. Double shifts? Carmen, you told me you only worked at the cafe. My child, I don't want you to sacrifice yourself for me. It's not a sacrifice, Mama. It's what family does, Carmen replied firmly. Meanwhile, in the luxurious penthouse, Alejandro Montero, the businessman, gazed out over the city from his terrace. He had spent the afternoon researching Carmen, using information that Manuel had managed to gather discreetly. Carmen Suarez, 27 years old, Manuel read from his tablet. She's worked at *El Rincón del Café * for 3 years, lives with her ill mother. No criminal record, no debts, no legal problems, a model citizen. What about her father? Alejandro asked. There's no record. It seems he abandoned them when Carmen was a child. Alejandro felt his admiration for Carmen grow. Despite her hardships, she maintained that bright smile and capacity to care for others. Tomorrow, I'll go back to the park, Alejandro announced. Alejandro, don't you think this is going too far? With each passing day, it will get harder to tell her the truth. I just need to understand her better, Manuel. There's something special about her, something I haven't seen in anyone else. Back in Carmen's apartment, Lucia was saying goodbye, promising to keep the secret of her second job. Before leaving, she stopped at the door. Carmen, promise me you'll be careful with that man in the park. We don't know anything about him. Sometimes, Carmen replied with a soft smile, you don't need to know everything about someone to see the kindness in their eyes. That night, as Carmen went over her savings for her mother's medications, she thought about Alberto and his sad gaze. Meanwhile, Alejandro, in his luxurious apartment, held the napkin with the pastry Carmen had given him, wondering how someone with so little could give so much. Neither of them could know that their lives were about to intertwine in ways that would change everything they believed about love, trust, and true wealth of the heart. In the days that followed, they established a routine. Every morning, Carmen stopped at the park bench before heading to work. What began as brief greetings turned into increasingly long conversations, prompting her to wake up earlier so as not to be late to the cafe. So, you like literature? Carmen asked one morning, surprised by Alberto's knowledge of the classics. Caught up in his own deception, Alejandro had to measure his words carefully. In my youth, I had access to many books, he replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. Garcia Marquez was always my favorite. His mine too, Carmen exclaimed with enthusiasm. When I was a child, my mother used to read *100 Years of Solitude * to me before bed. It's one of my most precious memories. These conversations revealed more and more common interests, shared tastes, and a connection that transcended their circumstances. For Alejandro, each morning was a discovery. Carmen shared her dreams of studying literature at university, plans she had postponed to care for her mother. Sometimes I feel that life is unfair, Carmen confessed one day, sitting next to him on the bench. But then I think of my mother, of how she never lost hope when my father left us, and I find the strength to carry on. Alejandro felt his heart ache with each story, and his guilt for deceiving her grew in proportion to his admiration for her. One morning, Carmen arrived especially early, carrying a paper bag. I brought something special for you today, she said with a smile, pulling out a thermos and 2 disposable cups. It's coffee from the cafe where I work. The chef lets me take the leftover coffee at the end of the day. Alejandro took the cup with trembling hands, aware that, at that very moment, his restaurant was serving imported coffee at exorbitant prices. I also brought you this, Carmen continued, taking a worn book out of her bag. It's my copy of *Love in the Time of Cholera Star. I thought you might like something to read. The gesture left him speechless. He, who could buy entire bookstores, found himself deeply moved by that used book, with pages marked and notes in the margins. Meanwhile, at *La Corona de Plata *, Manuel was dealing with the consequences of Alejandro's frequent morning absences. Mr. Montero, Lucia interrupted one afternoon when Alejandro finally appeared at the restaurant. The wine company needs to confirm the order for next month's event. Still lost in thoughts of his morning conversation with Carmen, Alejandro nodded absent-mindedly. Lucia observed him with curiosity, noting that the businessman seemed like a completely different person lately. At home, Carmen was also experiencing changes. Her mother noticed how she hummed while cooking and how her eyes sparkled when she talked about her morning encounters with Mr. Alberto. Carmen, Dona Rosa said one evening, you look smitten with that man. Mama, it's not what you think. I just enjoy talking to him. He's different from anyone I've ever met. My child, I've known you since the day you were born. I recognize that look. What Carmen didn't know was that very night, Alejandro was tossing and turning in his king-size bed, unable to sleep. The book she had lent him lay on his nightstand, next to business documents and million-dollar contracts. The disparity between his 2 lives had never been so evident. I'm falling in love with her, Alejandro confessed to Manuel the next day. And she's getting to know someone who doesn't exist, Manuel replied. You have to tell her the truth. Every day that passes will make it worse. What if she hates me? What if she thinks it was all a cruel game? What if she finds out from someone else? Have you thought about that? Lucia, the waitress, knows me. What if one day Carmen comes to the restaurant and sees me? The possibility terrified him. But the idea of losing those moments in the park, those honest conversations, that pure connection, frightened him even more. Fate, however, had its own plans. That same afternoon, while Carmen was delivering food for her second job, she received news that would change everything. Her mother's treatment needed to be adjusted, and the new medication cost 3 times more than the previous one. What she didn't know was that her encounter with Alberto in the park the next day would take an unexpected turn, one that would test everything they thought they knew about each other. That morning was different. When Carmen arrived at the park, her eyes were red from lack of sleep. She had spent the night making calculations, looking for ways to afford her mother's new treatment. Good morning, Alberto, she greeted him, trying to keep her usual smile, but Alejandro immediately noticed that something was wrong. Carmen, what's the matter? He asked with genuine concern, momentarily forgetting his role as a man in need. She sat beside him, holding her coffee thermos with trembling hands. It's my mother. The doctor changed her treatment yesterday. The new medication is much more expensive, and I don't know how I'm going to pay for it. Alejandro felt as if an invisible fist was squeezing his heart. In his pocket, the high-end smartphone he kept carefully hidden weighed like lead. With a single bank transaction, he could solve all of Carmen's problems. But that would mean revealing his true identity. Isn't there any government program that can help? He asked, already knowing the answer from the research he'd done. I've tried everything, Carmen replied, and for the first time, Alejandro saw her strength waver. Insurance doesn't cover this specific medication. Even with 2 jobs, she stopped abruptly, realizing she'd revealed more than she intended. 2 jobs? Alejandro asked gently. At that moment, a gust of wind stirred the pages of the book Carmen had lent him, and an old photograph slipped out from between them. Carmen quickly picked it up. It's my family, she explained, showing him the picture. When my father was still with us. It was taken in front of the bookstore where my mother worked before she got sick. Alejandro looked at the photograph. A younger Carmen smiled beside her parents in front of a small bookstore. His eyes lingered on the store's sign, *Sueños de Papel Star. It was a magical place, Carmen continued, lost in her memories. Mom knew every book, every story. She always said books were windows to other worlds. When Dad left and she got sick, we had to sell it. Alejandro listened, feeling that each word from Carmen made his deception heavier. He, who could buy 100 bookstores without blinking, sat there pretending to be someone he wasn't. Alberto, Carmen began, gathering her courage. There's something I need to tell you. But she was interrupted by the sound of her cell phone. It was a call from the hospital where her mother was being treated. Miss Suarez, we're calling to confirm the start of the new treatment next week. We need the payment in advance. Alejandro watched as Carmen's face turned pale as she listened. When she hung up, her hands were shaking. I have to go, she said abruptly, standing up. I'm already late for work. Carmen, wait. Alejandro stood up, momentarily forgetting his role, his posture, his voice. Everything about him subtly changed. I'll be fine, she said, forcing a smile. I always find a way. As he watched her walk away, Alejandro made a decision. He couldn't keep going like this. That afternoon, in his office at *La Corona de Plata*, he started making calls. Manuel, he called to his assistant, I need you to investigate something. The bookstore *Sueños de Papel Star. I want to know who bought it and if it's for sale. Alejandro, what are you planning? I'm going to help her, Manuel. But I need to do it in a way that she doesn't suspect it's from me. Don't you think it would be easier just to tell her the truth? Alejandro looked out the window at the park, where he had seen Carmen at her most vulnerable just hours earlier. The truth might drive her away forever. I need to find a way to help her without her knowing it comes from me. What Alejandro didn't know was that fate was about to take control of the situation. That same afternoon, as Carmen's friend Lucia arrived at the restaurant for her shift, she saw something that left her frozen in place. On Alejandro Montero's desk was the book Carmen had lent to Alberto. The truth was beginning to unravel, and no one was prepared for the consequences. Lucia stood motionless in front of Alejandro Montero's desk, trying to process what she was seeing. The worn book, with Carmen's unmistakable notes in the margins, seemed out of place amid the business documents and the elegant decor of the office. Do you need something, Lucia? Manuel's voice startled her. That book, she began, pointing to Garcia Marquez's novel. Why is it here? Manuel kept a neutral expression. Years of experience handling delicate situations with Alejandro had taught him not to reveal anything. Mr. Montero has an extensive book collection. No, that specific book belongs to my friend Carmen. She lent it to a man she met in the park, a man named Alberto. Understanding hit Lucia like a wave. It can't be. At that precise moment, Alejandro entered the office, lost in his thoughts about how to help Carmen. He froze when he saw Lucia standing by his desk, her eyes fixed on the book. Mr. Montero, Lucia said, her voice trembling with indignation. How could you do something like this? Lucia, I can explain, Alejandro began, closing the office door. Explain what?